Hello everyone, my partner and I are here today to report to you The Person-Centered Theory by Carl Rogers. So sit back, relax, and listen. Okay, so here we are with the overview of the Person-Centered Theory. The Person-Centered Theory was founded by Carl Rogers and was originally called by many titles, including the Client-Centered Theory. This theory is rather concerned about helping a person rather than studying the reason behind a person's action. This theory is likely to use the question, how can I help this person grow and develop, rather than what causes this person to develop in this kind of manner. Before we continue, we should tackle first the biography of Carl Rogers. Rogers was born in Oak Park, Illinois in the year 1902. He was born fourth among his 6 siblings from a devoutly religious family. Rogers briefly attended the seminary in 1924 with the intention of hopefully becoming a minister. But instead of becoming a minister, Rogers then turned to psychology instead and earned his PhD in Columbia in 1931. After several years, Rogers took a position in 1940 at Ohio State University. In 1951, he published The Person-Centered Therapy that would later become the Person-Centered Theory. In 1964, Rogers moved to California and helped in the formation of the Center for Studies of the Person. Rogers met his demise in 1987 following a surgery from a broken hip. The Person-Centered Theory. Although Rogers' concept of humanity remained basically unchanged from the early 1940s until his death in 1987, his therapy and theory underwent several changes in name. During the early years, his approach was known as non-directive, an unfortunate term that remained associated with his name for far too long. Later, his approach was variously termed client-centered, person-centered, student-centered, group-centered, and person-to-person. We used the label client-centered in reference to Rogers' therapy and the more inclusive person-centered to refer to Rogerian personality theory. Of all theories, it is said that the if-then framework is a standard for all. Of all the theories that was mentioned, Rogers' person-centered theory comes closest to meeting this standard. An example of an if-then construction is, if certain conditions exist, then a process will occur. If this process occurs, then certain outcomes can be expected. A more specific example is found in therapy. If the therapist is congruent and communicates unconditional positive regard and accurate empathy to the client, then therapeutic change will occur. If therapeutic change occurs, then the client will experience more self-acceptance, greater trust of self, and so on. The basic assumptions. Rogers postulated two broad assumptions: the formative and the actualizing tendency. First, the formative tendency. Rogers believed that there is a tendency for all matter, both organic and inorganic, to evolve from simpler to more complex forms. For the entire universe, a creative process, rather than a disintegrative one, is in operation. Rogers called this process the formative tendency and pointed to many examples from nature. For instance, complex galaxies of stars form from a less well-organized mass. Crystals, such as snowflakes, emerge from formless vapor. Complex organisms develop from a single cell. And human consciousness evolves from primitive unconsciousness to a highly organized awareness. Second, the actualizing tendency. An interrelated and more pertinent assumption is the actualizing tendency, or the tendency with all humans to move toward completion or fulfillment of potentials. This tendency is the only motive people possess: the need to satisfy one's hunger, drive, to express deep emotions when they felt, and to accept oneself are all examples of single motive of actualization. Because each person operates as one complete organism, actualization involves the whole person, physiological and intellectual, rational and emotional, consciousness and unconsciousness. The self and the self-actualization. According to Rogers, infants begin to develop a vague concept of self when a portion of their experience becomes personalized and differentiated in awareness as I or me experiences. Infants gradually become aware of their own identity as they learn what tastes good and what tastes bad, what feels pleasant and what does not. Then they begin to evaluate experiences as positive or negative, using the criterion, the actualizing tendency. Because nourishment is a requirement for actualization, infants value food and they value hunger. They also value sleep, fresh air, physical contact, and health because each of these is needed for actualization. The self concept. The self concept includes all those aspects of one's being and one's experiences that are perceived in awareness by the individual. The self concept is not identical with the organismic self. Portions of the organismic self may be beyond a person's awareness or simply not owned by that person. For example, the stomach is part of the organismic self, but unless it malfunctions and causes concerns, it is not likely to be part of one's self concept. Similarly, people can disown certain aspects of themselves, such as experience of dishonesty, when such experiences are not consistent with their self concept. Thus, once people form their self concept, they find change and significant learnings quite difficult. Experiences that are inconsistent with their self concept usually are either denied or accepted only in distorted forms. An established self concept does not make change impossible, merely difficult. Change most readily occur in an atmosphere of acceptance by others, which allows a person to reduce anxiety and threat and to take ownership of previously rejected experiences. The second subsystem of the self is the ideal self. It is defined as one's view of self as one wishes to be. The ideal self contains all those attributes, usually positive, that people aspire to possess. A wide gap between the ideal self and the self concept indicates incongruence and unhealthy personality. Psychologically healthy individuals perceive little discrepancy between their self concept and what they really ideally would like to be. Awareness. Without awareness, the self concept and the ideal self would not exist. Rogers defined awareness as the symbolic representation of some portion of our experience. He used the term synonymously with both consciousness and symbolization. Levels of awareness. According to Rogers, he recognized three levels of awareness. First, some events are experienced below the threshold of awareness and are either ignored or denied. An ignored experience can be illustrated by a woman walking down a busy street, an activity that presents many potential stimuli, particularly of sight and sound. Because she cannot attend all of them, many remained ignored. Next, an example of denied experience might be a mother who never wanted children, but out of guilt, she becomes overly solicitous to them. Her anger and resentment towards her children may be hidden to her for years, never reaching consciousness but yet remaining a part of her experience and coloring her conscious behavior towards them. Second, Rogers hypothesized that some experiences are accurately symbolized and freely admitted to the self structure. Such experiences are both non threatening and consistent with the existing self concept. For example, if a pianist who has full confidence in his piano playing ability is told by a friend that his playing is excellent, he may hear these words accurately symbolize them and freely admit them to his self concept. And the third level of awareness involves experiences that are perceived in a distorted form. When our experiences is not consistent with our view of self, we reshape or distort the experience so that it can be assimilated into our existing self-concept. If the gifted pianist were to be told by a distrusted competitor that his playing was excellent, he might react very differently than he did when he heard the same words from a trusted friend. He may hear the remarks but distort the meaning because he feels threatened. Why is this person trying to flatter me? This doesn't make sense. His experiences are inaccurately symbolized in awareness and therefore can be distorted so that they can conform to an existing self-concept that, in part, says, I am a person who does not trust my piano playing competitors, especially to those who are trying to trick me. Denial of positive experiences. Our example of the gifted pianist illustrates that it is not only the negative or derogatory experiences that are distorted or denied to the awareness. Many people have difficulty accepting genuine compliments and positive feedback, even when deserved. A student who feels inadequate but yet makes a superior grade might say to herself, I know this grade should be evidence of my scholastic ability, but somehow I just don't feel that way. This class was the easiest one on campus. Becoming a person. Rogers discussed the process necessary to becoming a person. First, an individual must make contact, either positive or negative, with another person. This contact is the minimum experience necessary for becoming a person. In order to survive, an infant must experience some contact from a parent or another caregiver. As children become aware that another person has some measure of regard for them, they begin to value positive regard and devalue negative regard. That is, the person develops a need to be loved, liked, or accepted by another person. A need that Rogers referred to as positive regard. If we perceive that others, especially significant others, care for, prize, or value us, then our need to receive positive regard is at least partially satisfied. And the third level of awareness involves experiences that are perceived in a distorted form. When our experiences is not consistent with our view of self, we reshape or distort the experience so that it can be assimilated into our existing self-concept. If the gifted pianist were to be told by a distrusted competitor that his playing was excellent, he might react very differently than he did when he heard the same words from a trusted friend. He may hear the remarks but distort the meaning because he feels threatened. Why is this person trying to flatter me? This doesn't make sense. His experiences are inaccurately symbolized in awareness and therefore can be distorted so that they can conform to an existing self-concept that, in part, says, I am a person who does not trust my piano playing competitors, especially to those who are trying to trick me.
Barriers to psychological health. Rogers believed that people are motivated by an innate tendency to actualize, maintain, and enhance the self. The process involves struggle and pain. For example, when children take their first steps, they may fall and hurt themselves. Although it would be less painful to remain in the crawling stage, most children persist. They may fall again and cry, but they persevere despite the pain because the tendency to actualize is stronger than the urge to regress simply because the growth process is difficult. Now, along life's way, there may be barriers to psychological health. The first one is conditions of worth. Conditions of worth, most people are not unconditionally accepted. Instead, they receive conditions of worth. That is, they feel that they are loved and accepted only when and if they meet the conditions set by others. Next involves incongruence. When the organism self, which includes an organismic valuing process, a process by which we judge experiences in terms of their value for fostering or hindering our actual growth and actualization. When the organismic self and the self-concept are at variance with one another, a person may experience incongruence, anxiety, threat, defensiveness, and even disorganization. Greater the incongruence, the more vulnerable that person becomes. Anxiety exists whenever the person becomes dimly aware of the discrepancy between the organismic experience and self-concept, whereas threat is whenever the person becomes more clearly aware of this incongruence. To prevent incongruence, people react with defensiveness. Defensiveness is the protection of the self-concept against anxiety and threat by the denial or distortion of experiences inconsistent with it, typically in the forms of distortion and denial. With distortion, people misinterpret an experience that it fits into their self-concept, while in denial, people refuse to allow the experience into awareness. When people's defenses fail to operate properly, their behavior becomes disorganized or even psychotic. Disorganization can occur suddenly or it can take place gradually over a long period of time. In this state, people sometimes behave consistently with their organismic experience and sometimes in accordance with their shattered self-concept. For person-centered psychotherapy to be effective, some conditions are necessary. Rogers called them the necessary and sufficient conditions for a therapeutic growth. The first is counselor congruence, or a therapist whose organismic experiences are matched by awareness and by the ability and willingness to openly express these feelings. Congruence is more basic than the other two conditions because it is a relatively stable characteristic of the therapist, whereas the other two conditions are unique to each specific therapeutic relationship. Next is the unconditional positive regard. Exists when the therapist accepts and prizes the client without conditions or qualifications. Therapists have unconditional positive regard when they are experiencing a warm, positive, and accepting attitude toward what is the client. The attitude is without possessiveness, without evaluations, and without reservations. Lastly, emphatic listening. It is the ability of the therapist to sense the feeling of a client and also to communicate these perceptions so that the client knows that another person has entered into his or her world of feelings without prejudice, projection, or evaluation. To accomplish this, Rogers stressed using reflection and other ways of being with the client. Accurate, emphatic understanding of the client is crucial, meaning that the therapist will sense the client's feelings as if they were his or her own without getting lost in those feelings. The theoretical explanation for change is the therapist provides an example within the relationship that the other person is unconditionally accepted and the other person realizes maybe for the first time that he or she is lovable. So now they are able to love themselves and give themselves unconditional positive regard. They can have empathy for themselves. Eventually, they possess the same three characteristics as any effective therapist, so they can become their own therapist.
Process of psychotherapy. If the condition of therapist congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy are present, then the process of therapeutic change will be set in motion. Although each person seeking psychotherapy is unique, Rogers believed that a certain lawfulness characterizes the process of therapy. Stages of therapeutic change. The process of constructive personality change can be placed on a continuum from most defensive to most integrated. Rogers divided this continuum into 7 stages. The first stage is characterized by an unwillingness to communicate anything about oneself. People at this stage ordinarily do not seek help, but if for some reason they come to therapy, they are extremely rigid and resistant to change. They do not recognize any problems and refuse to own any personal feelings or emotions. In the second stage, clients become slightly less rigid. They discuss external events and other people, but they still disown or fail to recognize their own feelings. However, they may talk about personal feelings as if such feelings were objective phenomena. As clients enter into stage 3, they more freely talk about self. Although still as an object, I am doing the best I can at work, but my boss still doesn't like me. Clients talk about feelings and emotions in the past or future tense and avoid present feelings. They refuse to accept emotions, keep personal feelings at distance from here and now situation, only vaguely perceive that they can make personal choices, and deny individual responsibility for most of their decisions. Clients in stage 4 begin to talk of deep feelings, but not ones presently felt. I was really burned up when my teacher accused me of cheating. When clients do express present feelings, they are usually surprised by this expression. They deny or distort experiences, although there may have been some dim recognition that they are capable of feeling emotions in the present. They begin to question some values that have been introjected from others, and they start to see the incongruence between their perceived self and their organismic self. They accept more freedom and responsibility than they did in stage 3, and begin to tentatively allow themselves to become involved in a relationship with a therapist. By the time clients reach stage 5, they begin to undergo significant change and growth. They can express feelings in the present, although they have not yet accurately symbolized those feelings. They are beginning to rely on eternal locus of evaluation for their feelings and to make fresh and new discoveries about themselves. They also experience a greater differentiation of feelings and develop more appreciation of nuances among them. In addition, they begin to make their own decision and to accept responsibility for their choices. People at stage 6 experience dramatic growth and irreversible movement toward becoming fully functioning or self-actualizing. They freely allow into awareness those experiences that they had previously denied or distorted. They become more congruent and are able to match their present experiences with the awareness and with open expression. They no longer evaluate their own behavior from an external viewpoint but rely on their organismic self as the criterion for evaluating experiences. They begin to develop unconditional self-regard, which means that they have a feeling of genuine caring and affection for the person that they have become. Stage 7 can occur outside the therapeutic encounter. Because growth at stage 6 becomes irreversible, clients who reach stage 7 become full functioning persons of tomorrow. They are able to generalize their in-therapy experiences to their world beyond therapy. They possess the confidence to be themselves at all times, to own and to feel deeply the totality of their experiences, and to live those experiences in the present. Their organismic self, now unified with the self-concept, becomes locus for evaluating their experiences. People at stage 7 receive pleasure in knowing that these evaluations are fluid and that change and growth will continue. In addition, they become congruent, possess unconditional positive self-regard, and are able to be loving and empathic towards others. Theoretical explanation for therapeutic change. What theoretical formulation can explain the dynamics of therapeutic change? Rogers' explanation follows this line of reasoning. When persons come to experience themselves as prized and unconditionally accepted, they realize, perhaps for the first time, that they are lovable. The example of the therapist enables them to prize and accept themselves, to have unconditional positive self-regard. As clients perceive that they are empathically understood, they are freed to listen to themselves more accurately, to have empathy for their own feelings. As a consequence, when these persons come to prize themselves and to accurately understand themselves, their perceived self become more congruent with their organismic experiences. They now possess the same three therapeutic characteristics as any effective helper, and in effect, they become their own therapist. So now, here is the expected outcomes of the psychotherapy. If the process of therapeutic change is set in motion, then certain observable outcomes can be expected. The most basic outcome of successful client-centered therapy is congruent client who is less defensive and more open to experience. Each of the remaining outcomes is a logical extension of this basic one. As a result of being more congruent and less defensive, clients have clearer picture of themselves and more realistic view of the world. They are better able to assimilate experiences into the self on the symbolic level. They are more effective in solving problems and they have higher level of positive self-regard. In addition, here are the goals of therapeutic change. First, to have a more realistic view of the world. To develop self-positive regard, narrow the gap between the ideal self and real self, to be less vulnerable to threat, become less anxious, take ownership of experience, become more accepting of others, and become more congruent in relationship with others.
The person of tomorrow. If people receive the three necessary and sufficient conditions for psychological health, then they will grow toward becoming the fully functioning person or the person of tomorrow. Rogers listed 7 characteristics of the person of tomorrow. First, these people will be more adaptable and more flexible in their thinking. Second, they would be open to their experiences accurately, symbolizing them in awareness rather than denying or distorting them. Persons of tomorrow would listen to themselves and hear their joy, anger, discouragement, fear, and tenderness. Third, characteristic would be a tendency to live fully in the moment, experiencing a constant state of fluidity and change. They would be able to see each experience with a new freshness and appreciate it fully in the present moment. Rogers referred to this tendency to live in the moment as existential living. Fourth, persons of tomorrow would remain confident of their own ability to experience harmonious relations with others. They would feel no need to be liked or loved by everyone because they would know that they are unconditionally prized and accepted by someone. Fifth, they would be more integrated, more whole, with no artificial boundary between conscious process and unconscious ones, because they would be able to accurately symbolize all their experiences in awareness. They would see clearly the difference between what is and what should be. 6. Person of tomorrow would have a basic trust of human nature. They would experience anger, frustration, depression, and other negative emotions, but they would be able to express rather than repress these feelings. And lastly, person of tomorrow are open to all their experiences. They would enjoy a greater richness in life than do other people. They would live in the present and participate more richly in the ongoing moment. Rogers' philosophy of science can be summarized as follows. Science begins and ends with subjective experience. Scientists must be involved with the phenomena being studied. Intuitive scientists perceive patterns among phenomena. Scientists communicate findings, but this communication is subjective. Rogers agreed with Maslow that scientists must care about the phenomena they study and that psychologists should limit their objectivity and precision to their methodology, not to the creation of hypotheses or to the communication of research findings. The Chicago Studies. When he taught at the University of Chicago and again at the University of Wisconsin, Rogers, along with colleagues and graduate students, conducted an experimental investigation on the effectiveness of client-centered therapy. These studies, though now old, remain as some of the best designed and most sophisticated of all such investigations. The study at the University of Chicago tested four broad hypotheses. As a consequence of therapy, 1. Clients will become more aware of their feelings and experiences. 2. The gap between the real self and the ideal self will lessen. 3. Clients' behavior will become more socialized. And 4. Clients will become both more self-accepting and more accepting of others. The methodology of these studies used the Q-sort technique to measure change from the client's point of view and to test hypotheses. Q-sort was the dependent variable. For example, in one study, there were 100 self-reference statements printed on 3x5 cards. An example of a statement would be, "I'm a good person." Now, participants were asked to sort these statements into piles, and at one point, there were 9 piles representing a continuum ranging from, say, on the one end, statements that were most like me, and the other and the piles represented statements that were least like me. The Q-sort was used to measure if people's concepts of themselves or others change as a result of treatment. The participants were adults who sought therapy at the University of Chicago Counseling Center. The findings of the Chicago studies showed that the therapy group, but not the weight group, showed a lessening of the gap between real self and ideal self. They also found that clients who improved during therapy showed changes in social behavior as reported by their friends compared to the normal control group. Clients who had undergone client-centered therapy showed greater congruence and higher emotional maturity. This still showed up at 6 and 12 months follow-up. Although client-centered therapy was successful in changing clients, it was not successful in bringing them to the level of the fully functioning persons or even to the level of normal psychological health, because becoming the person of tomorrow is difficult. Other researchers have investigated Rogers' facilitative conditions. In the 1980s, E. Torrey Higgins developed a version of Rogers' model called self-discrepancy theory. Higgins hypothesized that individuals with high levels of self-discrepancy were most likely to experience high levels of negative affect in their lives, such as anxiety and depression. Anne Phillips and Paul Silva predicted that high self-awareness of self-discrepancies is related to negative emotions. In other words, awareness of discrepancies would be greatest when people are more self-aware or self-focused. Their hypothesis was supported by their findings when they compared participants completing their questionnaires in front of a mirror to participants without a mirror. Other researchers have found that college students with a high discrepancy between real and ideal self-perceptions tended to drink more alcohol in a controlled setting. In general, these results supported Rogers' notion that people whose ideal self is at variance with their real self may turn to unhealthy behaviors as a means of coping with this discrepancy. As part of this theory, Rogers proposed that we all have an organismic valuing process or OVP, a natural instinct guiding pursuits toward the most fulfilling pursuits. Shelton and colleagues explored the existence of an OVP in college students. Their hypothesis that if people have an OVP over time, they will rate more inherently, fulfilling goals as more desirable than materialistic goals was supported by their findings. Swartz and Waterman found the organismic valuing process directs people toward fulfilling pursuits just as Rogers would have predicted. Rogers' person-centered theory is one of the most carefully constructed of all personality theories, and it meets quite well each of the six criteria of a useful theory. Rogers' theory is very high on practicality and internal consistency, high on falsifiability, parsimony, and organizing knowledge, and moderate on generating research.
In conclusion to this topic, here are Rogers' concept of humanity. He preferred optimism over pessimism. He believed that people have free choice. Teleology over casuality, conscious over unconscious, social influence over biology, and uniqueness over similarity. And that is all about the person centered theory by Carl Rogers. Thank you.